On June 6, 1944, Commander Samuel Dealey observed a scene through his periscope that would test every instinct honed by years of naval training. The surface broke momentarily, revealing 3 Japanese destroyers charging directly toward USS Harder's position off Tawi Tawi in the southern Philippines. The range measured 1,200 yards and rapidly closing. His executive officer, Frank Lynch, awaited the standard order that every submariner had drilled into memory: dive deep, run silent, and hope the enemy vessels pass overhead without detection. Commander Dealey refrained from issuing that conventional command. Instead, he prepared to execute a maneuver that submarine school instructors had explicitly forbidden, a tactic they had characterized as both suicidal and tactically insane. He aimed his submarine's bow directly at the lead destroyer and prepared to fire torpedoes in a direct frontal assault. Lynch's voice carried barely controlled tension as he noted their proximity to the enemy. Within the cramped control room, 79 men held their collective breath. The destroyer's screws thundered overhead with the intensity of an approaching freight train. Depth charges seemed imminent, ready to crush their hull with devastating force. What remained unknown to everyone aboard, and indeed to the entire Allied command structure, was that USS Harder had stumbled upon the most closely guarded secret of the Japanese Imperial Navy. Hidden within the sheltered waters of Tawi Tawi anchorage, just 6 miles distant, sat the entire Japanese mobile fleet. This massive concentration included the battleships Yamato and Musashi, 5 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. It represented the largest assembly of Japanese naval power since the Battle of Midway. The only barrier between this critical discovery and complete oblivion was a 311-foot Gado-class submarine suffering from a broken hydraulic system, dwindling oxygen reserves, and a commander determined to challenge established naval doctrine. The crisis in American submarine warfare. By June 1944, American submarines in the Pacific operated under severe constraints. Torpedo failure rates hovered near 50%. Standard doctrine mandated extreme caution, attack from long range, avoid escort vessels, and never under any circumstances engage a destroyer in direct confrontation. Over 2.5 years of war, this conservative approach had exacted a terrible price. 52 American submarines had been lost, with thousands of men now resting on eternal patrol beneath the Pacific waters. Commander Dealey could not have known that the following 4 days would fundamentally transform submarine warfare and force the Japanese Navy to abandon their hidden base, thereby disrupting their entire strategic plan for the Pacific theater. As the destroyer closed to 900 yards, then 800, then 700, Dealey ordered the firing of tubes 1, 2, and 3. The Pearl Harbor Conference. 11 months earlier, in October 1943, U.S. Pacific submarine commanders had gathered in Pearl Harbor for an emergency conference. The atmosphere carried a weight of grim concern. Admiral Charles Lockwood stood before a map marked with red crosses indicating sunken American submarines, each representing a catastrophic loss of men and equipment. Admiral Lockwood began by acknowledging the crisis facing the submarine force. The Mark 14 torpedo failure rate had reached unacceptable levels, with 50% either running too deep, failing to detonate, or exploding prematurely. American submarines were achieving only a fraction of their expected effectiveness against Japanese shipping. The statistics painted a damning picture. During the first 22 months of war, American submarines had sunk just 725 Japanese merchant vessels, falling far below projections. The Mark 14 torpedo, rushed into production without adequate testing, suffered from 4 critical flaws: faulty depth control, a magnetic exploder that detonated prematurely, a contact exploder that crumpled on impact, and an overall design that caused it to run 10 feet deeper than set. However, the torpedo represented only part of the problem. Submarine doctrine itself was proving inadequate. Captain John Cromwell, who commanded submarine operations in the Atlantic, presented the prevailing wisdom. Submarines needed to avoid surface escorts at all costs, as destroyers could outrun them, outmaneuver them, and destroy them with a single depth charge pattern. The submarine's role was to slip past escorts and strike merchant vessels, attacking from long range at 5,000 yards minimum before diving deep to evade. The assembled admirals found this logic sound and prudent, yet this same approach was proving strategically insufficient. In the audience sat a relatively unknown submarine commander. Samuel David Dealey, 36 years old, from Dallas, Texas, had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930 without particular distinction. He had spent most of the 1930s serving on battleships and destroyers. His submarine command experience dated only to December 1942, when he assumed command of USS Harder, fresh from the shipyard. Dealey possessed no advanced tactical training, no combat innovations to his name, and no particular reason to expect anything beyond competent performance.
Following the meeting, Dealey approached Admiral Lockwood with a radical proposal. He suggested they might be approaching the problem incorrectly. When Lockwood requested elaboration, Dealey explained that they were treating destroyers as threats to avoid, when destroyers themselves represented high-value targets. Every destroyer sunk meant one fewer escort protecting carriers and battleships. If they could develop reliable tactics for killing destroyers, the implications would be significant. Dealey trailed off, noting the skepticism on Lockwood's face. The commander acknowledged that analysis showed head-on attacks, known as down-the-throat shots, had a success rate below 10%. The torpedo spread proved too narrow, the target profile too small, and any miss left the destroyer immediately overhead with no time for escape. Dealey requested permission to attempt the tactic anyway. Lockwood questioned why anyone would risk their boat and crew on a tactic with a 90% failure rate. Dealey's response was straightforward. Without changing their approach, they would continue losing boats at the current rate. 52 submarines lost represented over 4,000 men. He expressed a preference for dying while attempting something new, rather than dying while repeating ineffective methods. The room fell into silence. Every officer present had lost someone who never returned. USS Wahoo, USS Grunion, USS Argonaut, USS Amberjack. The list lengthened each month. Expert consensus remained clear. Avoid destroyers, focus on merchant vessels, minimize risk. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 391 submarines and surface combatants, while the American submarine force maintained fewer than 150 operational boats in the Pacific. They could not afford to lose even one more submarine in a reckless attack. Admiral Lockwood rendered his decision. He denied the request and ordered Dealey to follow standard doctrine. As Dealey departed, he passed a bulletin board posting new orders. USS Harder had been assigned to patrol the approaches of Tawi Tawi, a remote anchorage in the southern Philippines, where intelligence suggested the Japanese might be establishing a staging area. The stakes had reached unprecedented levels. Allied forces were preparing to invade the Mariana Islands, with success depending on the Pacific Fleet locating and destroying the Japanese mobile fleet before it could interfere with operations. Japanese naval movements remained shrouded in mystery. No one suspected that the largest naval battle of the Pacific War would soon hinge on what one conventional submarine commander would discover and how he would respond. USS Harder's 5th Patrol. USS Harder departed Fremantle, Australia on June 5, 1944, for her 5th war patrol. The mission parameters appeared routine. Patrol waters around Tawi Tawi, report enemy movements, avoid engagement. However, something had shifted in Samuel Dealey's thinking. During Harder's 4th patrol, he had observed through his periscope as a Japanese freighter exploded from torpedo impacts. Through the lens, he watched lifeboats lowering and men jumping into the water. Then he observed the destroyer escorts racing in, ignoring the survivors and hunting exclusively for his submarine. They dropped 104 depth charges over 6 hours, nearly crushing Harder's hull. When the ordeal ended and he surfaced, he found only oil slicks and debris. The survivors from the freighter had drowned, while their own destroyers hunted the submarine. In his private journal that night, Dealey wrote that the destroyers represented the real enemy, not the merchant ships. Destroyers killed submarines. If they could eliminate destroyers, they could devastate Japanese supply lines, yet their training emphasized running from them. He questioned whether they should instead hunt destroyers. This represented heretical thinking. Destroyers were specifically designed to kill submarines. They possessed superior speed and maneuverability, bristling with depth charges and sonar equipment. The Type D destroyer carried 36 depth charges and could sprint at 34 knots. USS Harder's maximum surface speed barely reached 20 knots. Underwater, she could manage only 9 knots for brief periods before battery depletion.
Every tactical manual conveyed the same message: avoid destroyers or face destruction. Lying in his bunk that night, Dealey recalled something from his years serving on destroyers. In 1935, he had served aboard USS Rathburn during anti-submarine exercises. He had learned how destroyer captains thought and hunted, and he realized their greatest vulnerability. They expected submarines to flee. The following morning, Dealey posed a question to Frank Lynch. He asked what would happen if they refused to run, if they attacked head-on instead. Lynch responded with obvious concern. The Navy called that a down-the-throat shot, and training indicated it was nearly impossible to execute successfully. Dealey noted that training had also claimed their torpedoes worked perfectly, and training had been wrong about that. Lynch explained the geometric problem. When a destroyer approached head-on, the target profile measured only 30 feet wide. Their torpedo spread could not guarantee a hit, and any miss meant certain death. Dealey acknowledged the risk, but produced a notebook covered in calculations and diagrams. He had been working through the mathematics. If they waited until the destroyer closed to extremely close range, so close that sonar detection was certain, then their torpedoes could not miss either. At 1,000 yards, the spread pattern covered exactly the destroyer's width. Firing 3 torpedoes meant at least one would impact. Lynch pointed out that this meant allowing a destroyer to charge to point-blank range, which seemed insane. Dealey countered that it was unexpected, which meant it might work exactly once before the enemy adapted. If it failed, someone else would need to determine how to sink destroyers, because they were losing the war. Not on the macro scale of island-by-island progress, but in their specific domain, submarines kept departing and never returning. If even a chance existed that this approach worked, the risk seemed justified. First contact, June 6, 1944. On June 6, 1944, USS Harder surfaced off Tawi Tawi just before dawn. Dealey scanned the horizon through binoculars, searching for enemy contacts. What he observed prompted an urgent call to Lynch. Through the periscope lens, 3 destroyers were heading straight for Harder's position. Beyond them, barely visible in the morning haze, the massive silhouettes of battleships and carriers filled the anchorage. Lynch whispered in astonishment at the sight of the entire Japanese fleet. Dealey's mind raced through the implications. This intelligence was worth dying for, requiring immediate transmission to Pearl Harbor. However, the destroyers had spotted their periscope and were closing rapidly, their bows raising white spray as they accelerated. Standard doctrine called for diving to 400 feet, going silent, and letting them pass. Dealey's hand hovered over the dive alarm. Then he remembered the 52 submarines that had followed standard doctrine and never returned home. He quietly ordered battle stations, announcing his intention to kill one of the destroyers before running and reporting their discovery to Admiral Nimitz. The attack on Minatsuki. At 800 hours on June 6,
1944, the Japanese destroyer Minatsuki charged toward USS Harder's periscope at 30 knots. On her bridge, Commander Kato Shinsaku had spotted the American submarine and intended to ram it before it could dive, following standard anti-submarine tactics involving forcing the submarine down and peppering the water with depth charges until oil and debris surfaced. Commander Kato remained unaware that Samuel Dealey had no intention of diving. Dealey's voice cut through the tension, requesting range. The response indicated 1,000 yards and closing. Every man held his breath as the destroyer's screws became audible through the hull, a rhythmic thrashing growing louder by the second. In conventional attacks, submarines fired at 4,000 to 5,000 yards before immediately diving to escape. At 1,000 yards, no time remained for escape. If the torpedoes missed, Minatsuki would be directly overhead. Dealey requested bearing as his hands remained steady on the periscope. The response indicated 347 relative, dead ahead. Through the periscope, Dealey observed Minatsuki's bow wave. The destroyer appeared massive from this angle, resembling a wall of gray steel racing toward them. He could see sailors on deck and the muzzles of her deck guns. At 900 yards, in the forward torpedo room, 3 Mark 14 torpedoes waited in their tubes. Each fish carried 680 pounds of Torpex explosive. Each cost $10,000 to manufacture. Each had a 50% chance of failing. A single hit would break the destroyer in half. If all 3 failed, destruction was certain. At 800 yards, Dealey employed a technique his trainers had never taught. Instead of continuously watching the destroyer through the periscope, he closed his eyes and visualized the geometry. The torpedo spread diverged at exactly 2 degrees. At this range, that created a pattern 150 feet wide. The destroyer measured 380 feet long, but 34 feet wide from this angle. The mathematics were brutal. He needed to close further.
At 700 yards, Lynch's voice rose as he urged either firing or diving. The destroyer was preparing to ram them. Dealey opened his eyes to see Minatsuki filling his entire field of view through the periscope. He could see the bow wave breaking around her hull and muzzle flashes as her forward guns opened fire, with shells splashing into the water near their periscope. At 600 yards, Dealey ordered the firing of tubes 1, 2, and 3. 3 compressed air charges blasted the torpedoes from their tubes as they leaped into the water, propellers spinning up to 46 knots. The submarine shuddered from the launch. Dealey immediately ordered an emergency dive to 400 feet with depth charge rigging. Harder's bow tilted sharply downward as the crew grabbed pipes and rails during the plunge. The depth gauge spun rapidly, 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet. Time to impact measured 17 seconds at 200 feet depth. Dealey did not need to count, having performed the calculation 100 times in his notebook. 17 seconds at 46 knots meant his torpedoes would travel exactly 450 yards. The explosion shook Harder so violently that men were thrown against bulkheads. Light bulbs shattered and cork insulation rained from the ceiling like snow. Someone shouted confirmation of a hit, but Dealey was already ordering continued diving under silent running protocols. Hitting the destroyer represented only half the battle. Now they needed to survive the consequences. Above them, Minatsuki's hull split open just forward of her bridge. The destroyer's bow tore away as flooding consumed the forward compartments. She slewed to starboard, her screws churning uselessly as she began sinking. Her 2 sister ships were already racing toward Harder's last known position. At 300 feet, they heard another sound through the hull, depth charges hitting the water. Orders came to brace for impact. The first depth charge detonated 200 feet above them, followed by another, then 6 more in rapid succession. The explosions felt like giant hammers smashing the submarine's hull. Men grabbed anything bolted down as lights flickered and died, plunging the control room into darkness except for red battle lanterns. In the darkness, Dealey's voice remained calm as he requested a damage report. The chief engineer called out that the hydraulic system was compromised with lost pressure on the stern planes, requiring manual compensation. Oxygen had dropped to 60% of reserves. The crew was injured. The secret workshop where Dealey had tested his theory, the notebook full of calculations, the private drills with torpedo crews, everything had worked, but barely. They had achieved 1 kill and now found themselves trapped beneath 2 very angry Japanese destroyers with failing hydraulics and limited air. Lynch whispered that what they had just done was illegal, that the Navy would court-martial Dealey if they knew. Dealey wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands shaking as the adrenaline faded. He noted that sending men out to die with defective torpedoes and outdated tactics was also illegal. They had just proven this approach worked. Now they needed to survive long enough to repeat it. Above them, depth charges continued falling, but Harder slipped away into the dark Pacific depths, leaving Minasuki bubbling down to the ocean floor. When the crew surfaced 4 hours later to ventilate the boat, they were exhausted, terrified, and exhilarated. They had accomplished the impossible. Waiting for them above the horizon were 4 more Japanese destroyers, all hunting for the submarine that had killed Minasuki. The radio transmission. On June 7, 1944, at 0600 hours, Samuel Dealey composed the most important radio transmission of his career, his hands still shaking from the previous day's depth charging. Around him, USS Harder's crew performed emergency repairs to the hydraulic system. Standard procedure called for retreat to safety, yet Dealey wrote an urgent message reporting the discovery of the Japanese mobile fleet anchored at Tawi Tawi. He estimated 2 battleships, 5 carriers, 13 cruisers, and over 30 destroyers. The message noted the sinking of Minasuki using down-the-throat tactics and indicated Harder's intention to continue patrol. He instructed his radio operator to send the message in clear transmission if necessary, as Pearl Harbor needed this information immediately. The response arrived 90 minutes later, not from Admiral Lockwood, but from Captain John Cromwell, submarine operations commander for the Southwest Pacific. The message ordered Harder to return to base immediately and not engage enemy destroyers. It repeated the prohibition on engagement and emphasized that the primary mission was intelligence gathering, not combat. The message requested confirmation of receipt. Frank Lynch read the message and observed that the orders seemed clear enough. Dealey crumpled the paper, noting that the Japanese fleet knew they had been spotted and would relocate within 24 hours. Leaving now meant losing track of them. The invasion of Saipan was scheduled to begin in 8 days, and Admiral Spruance needed to know the fleet's destination. Lynch pointed out that this represented a direct order to withdraw. Dealey stated that he would face the court-martial later, but that a destroyer currently required sinking, and he intended to provide the Navy with sufficient evidence that down-the-throat tactics worked, forcing a change in doctrine regardless of preference. What followed would be debated in Naval War College classrooms for decades. Second kill, Hayanami. At 0742 hours, USS Harder spotted destroyer Hayanami searching for them. Instead of evading, Dealey maneuvered to attack position. At 1,150 yards, he fired 3 torpedoes down Hayanami's throat. 2 struck their target. The destroyer sank in 4 minutes, her stern rising vertically before sliding beneath the waves. By nightfall on June 7th, Dealey had violated direct orders, sunk 2 Japanese destroyers using what many considered suicidal tactics, and triggered a crisis in Japanese high command. Aboard battleship Yamato, anchored in Tawi Tawi, Vice Admiral Ugaki Matame wrote in his diary that the American submarine threat had become intolerable. In 2 days, they had lost 2 destroyers to a single enemy boat. This submarine appeared to be hunting their escorts specifically, representing a radical departure from usual tactics. If Americans had developed effective anti-destroyer methods, their entire convoy system faced risk. The debate in Pearl Harbor. On June 9, 1944, at 1400 hours in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Lockwood's office erupted in argument. Cromwell had flown in from Brisbane specifically to demand Dealey's relief of command. He argued that Dealey was ignoring direct orders and risking his boat and crew on cowboy tactics that would get them killed. He demanded Harder be pulled from patrol immediately. Lockwood held up 2 patrol reports, noting that in 2 days Commander Dealey had sunk 2 Japanese destroyers with confirmed kills. This represented more destroyers than the entire submarine force had sunk in the previous 2 months. The tactics might be unorthodox, but the results were undeniable. Cromwell argued the results represented lucky survival. The down-the-throat shot had a 10% success rate. Dealey was 3 for 6 on torpedo hits, suggesting either blind luck or suicidal overconfidence. Either way, the next attempt would likely result in Harder's hull scraped off the ocean floor. The room erupted in debate. Officers took sides as voices rose. Someone mentioned USS Wahoo, which had attempted aggressive tactics under Commander Dudley Morton and was lost with all hands in October 1933. Others countered that Morton's loss resulted from shallow water operations, not tactical aggression.
Captain Richard Voge, Lockwood's operations officer, stood up to address the assembly. He stated that the question was not whether Dealey's tactics were risky. They obviously were risky. The question was whether they worked, and more importantly, whether they could afford to keep losing submarines while following conservative doctrine that was not working. Lockwood raised his hand for silence. Dealey had reported discovering the Japanese mobile fleet at Tawi Tawi, with intelligence confirming this as their primary anchorage. If his information proved accurate and he could track their movements, they could intercept the fleet before it reached the Marianas. That intelligence alone justified significant risk. Cromwell demanded to know what would happen if Dealey got himself killed. Lockwood responded that if Dealey got himself killed, that outcome would occur. However, Lockwood would not order a successful commander to stop doing what worked simply because it made them uncomfortable. Dealey had sunk more enemy destroyers in 2 days than most boats sank in their entire patrol. Until he failed, Lockwood would let him continue. Cromwell protested that this was madness. Lockwood's voice turned ice cold as he responded that this was war. In war, the choice was not between safe options and dangerous options, but between losing slowly with conservative tactics or winning quickly with aggressive ones. He chose winning. The room fell silent. Lockwood instructed his radio operator to send a message to Harder, authorizing continuation of the mission with weapons free, permission to sink enemy destroyers at discretion, and wishing them good hunting. 9,000 miles away, Samuel Dealey received Lockwood's message while stalking his 3rd destroyer. He showed it to Lynch, who quietly observed that now they really had to make this work. Dealey nodded, commenting that they were about to discover whether he was a tactical genius or just the luckiest fool in the Pacific. 3rd kill, Tanikaze. On June 9, 1944, at 16:45 hours, destroyer Tanikaze charged toward their position. Dealey allowed it to close to 1,200 yards before firing. 2 hits broke Tanikaze in half. 3 destroyers in 4 days represented something the Japanese Navy had never encountered. They were about to make a decision that would change the entire Pacific campaign. The final battle. On June 10, 1944, at 05:30 hours, Samuel Dealey had not slept in 48 hours. USS Harder's crew operated on adrenaline and coffee. The hydraulic system was held together with patch welds and hope. Oxygen reserves sat at 43%. Standard procedure dictated surfacing, ventilating the boat, and withdrawing to safety. Instead, Dealey surfaced just long enough to recharge batteries and send another report to Pearl Harbor. The message included precise specifications, attack ranges, torpedo spread patterns, success rates. He was not merely sinking destroyers, but documenting exactly how to kill them. The data was revolutionary. Conventional long-range attacks at 4,000 to 5,000 yards achieved a 23% hit rate. Dealey's down-the-throat tactics at 900 to 1,200 yards achieved a 67% hit rate. The destroyer kill ratio stood at 3 sunk with 6 torpedoes fired. Submarine survival rate remained at 100% so far. The real test arrived at dawn. Through his periscope, Dealey spotted something that caused his stomach to drop. Not 1 destroyer, not 3, but 6 Japanese destroyers in formation, conducting a coordinated search pattern, hunting specifically for him. Behind them, moving out of Tawi Tawi anchorage, were battleships Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest warships ever built. The Japanese were not merely hunting anymore, they were fleeing. Lynch warned that this represented a full convoy escort conducting sonar searches. They knew Harder's location. Dealey studied the formation through the periscope. The destroyers were spread in a picket line with constant sonar pinging. Behind them, the battleships moved slowly and cautiously, protected by layers of escorts. The entire Japanese mobile fleet was evacuating Tawi Tawi, abandoning their secret anchorage because of 1 American submarine. Operation Khan, the Japanese plan to reinforce their garrison at Biak and draw the American fleet into decisive battle, was falling apart. Without their secret anchorage, the Japanese Navy had nowhere to stage for the offensive. Dealey did not yet understand this broader context. All he knew was that 6 destroyers were hunting him, and if he did not stop them, they would sink Harder. He announced his intention to target the lead destroyer. Lynch's voice cracked as he protested that this was suicide. They could possibly not succeed. Dealey told him to count the destroyers, 6, then count their torpedo tubes, 6 forward tubes. If they could reload quickly enough, they might sink all of them. Lynch pointed out that the destroyers might sink them in the attempt. Dealey responded, they'd better not miss. Attack on Kazagumo. On June 10, 1944, at 06:35 hours, the lead destroyer Kazagumo, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Takuno Minoru, had received specific orders from Vice Admiral Ugaki to locate and destroy the American submarine terrorizing their forces. The honor of the Imperial Navy depended on eliminating this threat.